Ask how? Howard! The Humongous. The war, hang on, the software is bothering me and it's asking me questions. There, okay, we've answered the questions. The sock puppet war in Syria, the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran that is presented to you and me as a war between Bashar Assad and the rebels is becoming very, very peculiar. It's taking on international twists. In the last couple of days, we've had, well, actually 2 weeks ago, we had an invasion of several hundred armed men into the city of Zamboanga in the Philippines, which is approximately 10,000 miles away from Syria. And these were members of a Moro Liberation Front. There are two Moro Liberation Fronts who were unsatisfied with a peace agreement and as a consequence have taken hostages. Originally there were about 140 of them and now it's down to 40. But there have been 100,000 refugees. It's 2 weeks later. The battle is still continuing between the military and this Islamic, so-called Islamic Liberation Group. Meanwhile, in Kenya, in an upscale shopping mall, a group of Muslim militants. What do these Philippine groups and the Kenyans have in common? They're Muslim militants. They are Islamic militants. An Islamic militant group has barged into a mall in the Philippines, has very carefully separated the people it considers to be Muslims from the non-Muslims, and then has begun shooting the non-Muslims like crazy. There have been 300 people wounded. They're being treated in hospitals. 39 are dead. There is a group of hostages. We still don't know how many hostages there are. The fight goes on. The militant group behind this, the Islamic militant group behind this, Al-Shabaab, which ran a country called Somalia for a while and then was driven out by forces supported by the United States, says it's absolutely not giving up in its fight over this shopping mall, nor, frankly, is it giving up in its fight over the world. What in the world does this have to do with Syria? Well, a few days ago, we did an episode on who is the fist in sock puppet number one in the proxy war in Syria. And it is Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia has called in somebody from retirement who's had an incredible success at puppeteering the United States in sock puppet wars. His name is Prince Bandar al-Sultan. He is sock puppeting side number one, trying to get Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and anybody else who's sympathetic to support the Syrian rebels. The Syrian rebels are a sock puppet for the Saudis. Why are the Saudis fighting in Syria? Because they're fighting the Iranians. The Iranians are behind Bashar Assad. Why are the Iranians supporting Bashar Assad? Well, frankly, there's an attempt to take over the world of Islam, the Middle East, and beyond that, the globe. I kid you not about the globe. You can find it in the rhetoric of the founding father of the Islamic Revolutionary State in Iran. The founding father, the George Washington, who says that non-Islamic governments have to be crushed with an iron hand, have to be destroyed. Any people who stand against the reign of Islam, Islam dominating and ruling the world, have got to not only be crushed with an iron hand, he uses another word, they have to be annihilated. Those are the statements of the founding father of the Islamic Revolutionary Republic. Is there a fist in sock puppet number two in Syria? We have Bandar al-Sultan, Prince Bandar, in sock number one, representing the Saudis. Is there somebody in sock puppet number two representing the Iranians? You bet. His name is Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani. He has been in charge of something called the Quds Force, the Quds Brigade, a part of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. He's been in charge of it since approximately 2000. What is the Quds Force? The Quds Force, well, we don't have a simple translation into English for what it is. We would call it an external expeditionary force or some sort. It is a force whose job is to take over the rest of the world, is to fight for Islam, to fight jihad on behalf of an Islamic takeover, an Islamic revolutionary takeover of the world in whatever nations you can. And to that end, I used to say that Qasem Soleimani used to be simple. Qasem Soleimani controlled 5 proxy armies in the Middle East. It's not so simple anymore, because Qasem Soleimani controls more than that. What does Qasem Soleimani control? He'll tell you what his portfolio is. His portfolio includes Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and actually a good deal more. Those are the things he'll say openly. And what does he control in these territories? Well, remember, once upon a time, we were given a whole bunch of intelligence, absolutely solid intelligence, complete with all kinds of defectors, who told us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, remember, the Iranians and the Iraqis had fought for 8 years in an Iranian attempt to take over Iraq. Iraq is its closest neighbor. It had a revolution in 1979, an Islamic revolution, whose goals were to have a worldwide revolution and dominate the entire world. And the obvious place to take over first was the country next door, Iraq. So it fought at a cost of $1 trillion and 1 million men to take over Iraq. It tried to knock off Saddam Hussein, and it couldn't do it. It fought the war to an absolute standstill, using, by the way, lots of missiles in the process. Then it appears, and I've got tons of research that supports this case, it appears that the Iranians, who are renowned in the Middle East for their deviousness, their cleverness, their ability to adapt, their ability to come up with clever, underhanded solutions to all kinds of problems, came up with another way to get rid of Saddam Hussein and take over Iraq. What was that way? Well, let's get Mikey to do it. Let's get the United States to do it. How in the world would you do something like that? Well, feed the United States a whole bunch of phony intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And actually, that turns out to be easy, because Saddam Hussein has been busy advertising, promoting, and publicizing weapons of mass destruction he doesn't actually have. Why? To intimidate his own enemies in the Middle East. So the Iranians apparently were the ones who fed us all the information that we swore was absolutely accurate on weapons of mass destruction. We did what that information implied that we should do. We floundered, bounced, and flumbled into Iraq and knocked off Saddam Hussein. Guess who ended up, after many years, after the expenditure of at least $1 trillion American dollars, guess who ended up in control of Iraq? Iran. The current prime minister of Iraq, al-Maliki, spent 20 years in Iran. A guy named Qasem Soleimani, Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani, controls 2 proxy armies, the Badr Brigade and one whose name I always forget, you'll have to forgive me, but it has been the major militia, the most powerful militia in Iraq. He controls those 2 proxy armies, and he seems to control a good deal more. A year and a half ago, you weren't told about it. Most of us weren't told about it. Iran declared victory in Iraq. Who controls Iraq? Well, basically, Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani, the other hand in the sock puppet war between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Syria. The man who provides the support and occasionally flies into Baghdad to provide the support for Bashar Assad. What in the world does that have to do with Al-Shahab, you're going to get totally confused by these names. I will get totally confused by these names. By Al-Shahab, the Muslim militants barging into a mall in Kenya and killing a whole mess of people. What does it have to do with an entire city in panic and under siege right now, Zamboanga, 10,000 miles away in the Philippines, with hostages being taken and ongoing gun battles? Everything. Remember, this is all a sock puppet war between Saudi Arabia, a good deal of it, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Where else is Saudi Arabia active? Well, let's follow the trail for a second of Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani. the Iranian fist in the sock of the Syrian civil war. His name is hard to keep track of. Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was originally brought in to fight in another proxy war between two sock puppets, a war in, of all places, Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, working together, had created a sock puppet. That sock puppet was called the Taliban. And the Taliban were the folks we were trying to knock over when we invaded Afghanistan. The Iranians saw this as an opportunity, jumped in and supported a bunch of forces of their own in an attempt to take Afghanistan from, guess who? The Pakistanis and the Saudis. This was a sock puppet war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with the United States being sock puppeted, the fist in the sock puppet of the United States, by Saudi Arabia, who ironically, wait, I'm getting this confused. You'll have to bear with me. The Saudis were sock puppeting us, but not very successfully because they control. The Saudis apparently work on a formula. I'm still trying to figure this out. The Saudis work on a formula of the enemy of my enemy is my enemy and support both sides, and that way, no matter which side wins, you win. The Saudis and the Pakistanis created the Taliban from scratch in madrasas that were supported by the Saudis on the Pakistani border. Have you got that? The Taliban was created by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the fist in the sock puppet of the rebels in Syria. And meanwhile, the Saudis also manipulate us, no matter who wins in Afghanistan. The Saudis win, but the Iranians didn't want it that way. They wanted to win Afghanistan for themselves. They did not succeed. But who was the man in charge? It was the early days of Qasem Soleimani running the Quds Brigade, and he learned lessons from his failures in Afghanistan. Where else was Qasem Soleimani put to work? He was put to work in Bosnia. Back in the 1990s, nobody seems to remember it today, the United States went to war and spent a lot of money. Where did we go to war? Bosnia. Who was pushing us into the war in Bosnia? The Saudis. Who wanted to use Bosnia and take it as their own and get the Saudis out of there so they could have a foothold in Europe? The Iranians. That was Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani lost that one too, but that was in his early days in the Quds Brigade, and he learned lessons from his losses. Where else are the Saudis and the Syrians, Prince Bandar and Qasem Soleimani, at each other's throats in the world today? In the Philippines. The Philippine Moro Army, Moro Liberation Army, has invaded Zamboanga because it is unhappy about a peace deal that the government of the Philippines has made with a rival Muslim liberation group. One liberation group, the one that has made the peace deal with the Philippine government, is supported by, guess who? It was set up in part with the help of Osama bin Laden, who sent his brother-in-law to help the group along in its early days. And a rival Muslim liberation group, a non-Saudi liberation group, is unhappy with a deal that now gives over 50% of the oil, 50% of the oil revenues and 75% of the mineral revenues of this oil and mineral-rich province that the Muslims want to control. It now gives all those revenues to a rival, non-Saudi-backed, non-Al-Qaeda backed group. No, wait, we got to keep this straight. It's giving all this money to an Al-Qaeda backed, Saudi backed group, and the non-Al-Qaeda, non-Saudi group is unhappy about it and is invading, if you can keep this track of this, and you can keep this straight, send me an email, and I will worship you. Meanwhile, down in Kenya, where there's been the invasion of a shopping mall, who is behind Al-Shabaab, the group that has pulled off the invasion? You've got it, the Saudis. This is more of the attempt to spread Saudi extremism throughout the world. The point, is there a point to all of this nonsense? It all leads back to the Syrian war. The Syrian war is between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has spent $10 billion to spread its brand of Islamic extremism around the world. Iran is using Qasem Soleimani to spread its breed of extremism around the world. The result is havoc. Havoc all the way from the Western Sahara, Nigeria, and Mali, to Kenya, Syria, Bosnia, Central Asia. Qasem Soleimani has been very active in Central Asia. Central Asia brought us the two brothers who gave us the Boston Marathon bombing, and the Philippines, where we have people who are hostages and people being killed at this very second. Do you have to keep any of this straight? No. It would be a miracle if you could. All you have to know is that there is a war between Islam and the rest of the world, boys and girls. Not all Islam, just militant Islam. And that war goes on within the Muslim world between militant Islam, extremist Islam, and moderate, pluralist, modernist Muslims who don't want anything to do with all this murderous crap. If you can keep that straight, you get an award, but it explains most of the headlines about mass violence in the world today. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future, that it's not only your job and my job to make, it's your job and my job to keep straight. Now let me see if I can find the off button.